So this coming Sunday, we read a passage from Mark 2 about the healing of the man in Capernaum whose friends carve a hole in the roof to let him in. And then we read a passage from Hebrews 1 to 2. And I'll say a few things about both of those so that people can, if they would like, talk about one or the other or somehow combine them. First, let me read the passage from Mark 2. And when he returned to Capernaum after some days, it was reported that he was at home. And many were gathered together so that there was no longer room for them, not even about the door, and he was preaching the word to them. And they came, bringing to him a paralytic carried by 4 men. And when they could not get near him because of the crowd, they removed the roof above him, and when they had made an opening, they let down the pallet on which the paralytic lay. And when Jesus saw their faith, he said to the paralytic, "My son, your sins are forgiven." Now some of the scribes were sitting there, questioning in their hearts, "Why does this man speak thus? It is blasphemy. Who can forgive sins but God alone?" And immediately Jesus, perceiving in his spirit that they thus questioned within themselves, said to them, "Why do you question thus in your hearts? Which is easier, to say to the paralytic, 'Your sins are forgiven,' or to say, 'Rise, take up your pallet and walk'? But that you may know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins," he said to the paralytic, "I say to you, rise, take up your pallet and go home." And he rose and immediately took up the pallet and went out before them all, so that they were all amazed and glorified God, saying, "We never saw anything like this." First of all, the way I've presented the passage introduces the first item that I want to discuss about it. And that is, you notice that we start with the discussion of the man who is ill, whose friends bring him to the house. And then we take a detour for a moment and we have a discussion about whether or not Jesus has the authority to forgive sins. And then we go back to the man who is ill, right? There's sort of, and this feature of this episode is something that happens all over the Gospel of Mark. And because we imagine that Mark is the first of the Gospels, you see it sometimes in Matthew and Luke. Sometimes Matthew and Luke will continue this. Sometimes they'll move things around a little bit and break up this system. But the way it works is you start a story about one thing. In the middle, you pause and talk about something else, and then you go back to the first story. And here are the examples of all the places in Mark where this happens. Again and again and again. And the most famous example is in Mark 11, right before Jesus is arrested and taken to his crucifixion, where it says, on the following day when they came from Bethany, he was hungry, right? And he goes to the fig tree, right? And he said to it, he curses the fig tree and says, "May no one ever eat from you again." And his disciples heard it. And so he goes to the fig tree that has no fruit, and he curses the fig tree. And then he goes into the temple. And they came to Jerusalem, and he entered the temple and began to drive out those who sold and those who bought in the temple. And he overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold pigeons. And he would not allow anyone to carry anything through the temple. And he taught, and he said to them, "Is it not written, 'My house shall be called a house of prayer for all the nations,' but you have made it a den of robbers?" And the chief priests and the scribes heard it and sought a way to destroy him, for they feared him, because all the multitude was astonished at his teaching. And then he goes back and he sees the fig tree again. As they passed by in the morning, they saw the fig tree withered away to its roots. And Peter remembered and said to him, "Master, look, the fig tree which you cursed has withered." What this does is tell us that the episode of the fig tree, which starts and ends this scene, explains what happens in the middle with the cleansing of the temple. In the same way that the fig tree isn't bearing fruit and deserves to be cut down, so the temple has been turned into a place that does not bear fruit and must be put aside as well. So when we get to our episode, we see that the episode of the man who is sick and is ill is surrounds this story of Jesus' authority, and especially his authority to forgive sins. But this plays into a Markan concern, which shows that what God is able to do is something that, I'm sorry, what human beings are not able to do, God is able to do. Jesus' might and strength comes to save people when they cannot save themselves. And his healing is an expression of his ability to conquer both sin and illness. And the Gospel of Mark has this quality of like a cosmic invasion, where Jesus comes in and he silences evil spirits and he silences his opponents. And the first element of his power and his might is that he is able to do that, to conquer them. But he also is able to teach in a way that other teachers are not. And the best expression of this is when Jesus tells the story of the kingdom that is divided against itself. And he says, you cannot go into a strong man's house unless you first tie up the strong man. And that word strong is the Greek word ischiros. Well, if you have to first go into the house of the ischiros, of the strong man, you have to be stronger. And what does John the Baptist say about Jesus when he baptizes him? He says, "After me comes one who is stronger than me," and the Greek word is ischiroteros. So Jesus is the stronger man who comes into the house of the strong man, the devil, and is able to tie him up. And we see in these episodes Jesus' power and his authority, both to forgive sins, but also to heal the illnesses of the people. So the episode of the weakness of the man and the inability of the man to be healed shines a light on Jesus' ability to do what we cannot. It's also interesting to note something about the scribes that are in this episode, right? Because, and I've written a note, we imagine that Jesus' debates with the leaders of Israel were based on the content of his teaching alone, but it's likely that his opponents objected not only to what he said, but to the mere fact of his saying it. Because he's a laborer, a carpenter, a tekton in Greek. And laborers are understood to be a class apart from scribes and educated people. Laborers were unable to develop enough knowledge of the law to teach others because they had to spend their time at their work, whereas the scribe had the leisure to gain expertise in the things of the law. And it's no coincidence that the Greek word school, scholi, literally means leisure. This doesn't imply that education is a form of relaxation, but that education is a luxury available to those whose wealth permits them the leisure not to work in the fields or at a trade. And we see this described in Ben Sirach, or the wisdom of Sirach, where he says, the wisdom of the scribe depends on the opportunity of leisure. And he who has little knowledge little business may become wise. How can he become wise who handles the plow, and who glories in the shaft of a goad, who drives oxen and is occupied with their work, and whose talk is about bulls? He sets his heart on plowing furrows, and he is careful about fodder for the heifers. So too is every tekton, craftsman. That's what Jesus is called. And master workman who labors by night as well as by day. Those who cut the signets of seals, right? He lists all these different kinds of workmen. And he says, without them, a city cannot be established, right? We need workmen. We need farmers. We need craftsmen. And then he says this, yet they are not sought out for the counsel of the people, nor do they attain eminence in the public assembly. They do not sit in the judge's seat, nor do they understand the sentence of judgment. They cannot expound discipline or judgment, and they are not found using proverbs, right? That's why they often respond. That's why the scribes respond very negatively to Jesus. It's not just that he's teaching. It's not just what he's teaching. It's the mere fact that he's teaching. They say in Mark 6 and in Matthew 13, is this not the carpenter, the son of Mary? Is this not the son of the carpenter? In chapter 7, the Jews were astounded, saying, how has this man become learned, having never been educated? In other words, they don't even want him talking. It's not just what he's saying, it's that he's saying it. And so when the scribes appear here, they are one of Jesus's um, most implacable foes because they do not recognize that he even has the right to talk. But what's most powerful in this passage is the way that there's an obstacle to faith. The men who bring in their friend the paralytic can't get to Jesus. They want their friend to be healed, but they can't get to Jesus because first there is a crowd, and then there is the obstacle of the building. And so what do? They break through the obstacle. They carve a hole in the mud brick of the house, and they lower their friend in, right? But there is this obstacle, right? Lots of people have these obstacles. There's the woman with the issue of blood who meets Jesus in the crowd, who can't even touch him, but she just touches the hem of his garment. There's the father of the epileptic boy who's pushed away by the impotent disciples. The disciples tell him, get this guy away from us. The blind Bartimaeus is also driven away by Jesus's companions before he's noticed, right? Likewise, sometimes people are healed and they are not turned to faith. When Jesus heals the 10 lepers in Luke 17, only one person returns. Jesus says, weren't 10 healed? But in the fallen world, faith is not easy. And obstacles come from all kinds of places. Sometimes the obstacle to finding Jesus in our lives is the way that we've structured our lives. Right? How can we go to church on Sunday when our children have sports? How can we bring our children to church events when they have such busy social lives? How can I be a good steward of the church when I have so many other commitments? The obstacle here is that we do not want to give up things in our lives as we have structured our lives. If we overcome these things and devote ourselves more deeply to Christ, though, our faith will flame up. We ourselves are the obstacle. Sometimes, and this one's very prominent, the obstacles are the other disciples. Look at the stories where the disciples ask Jesus to send someone away. People are coming to God, and the disciples are not welcoming them, but sending them away. People in our churches seem not to help our faith, but to put an obstacle to it. They don't help us find God, they drive us away from him. Sometimes, as shocking as it is to say or even to contemplate, we are told to carry a cross, but it's our fellow parishioners, it's our fellow Christians who are the ones crucifying us. It's essential that our churches be places where visitors are welcome and where our parishioners are taught and guided to deal with one another with Christian kindness, with patience, with forgiveness. This is something very important to stress during Lent, because this is the time when we can really lift it up, so that our churches are not places where people hate each other for 20 years, but where they find some way to be reconciled. But if the obstacles are either the way that we've constructed our lives or other disciples, sometimes God himself is the obstacle, right? Sometimes we have been formed in a way or raised in a way that God seems unacceptable to us. There are certain people, conversely. I was just in Greece, and I had a friend who was referring to two people that he knew, and he said that they were raised in such calm, kind families, where the parents were very faithful, but they were not overbearing in their religiosity, and the boys were just raised. They couldn't be any other way except kind and calm and very faithful. They're simple, loving people, and it's they just couldn't be any other way. On the opposite hand, some of us are raised in ways or formed in ways that faith is very hard. And or if it's not that faith is very hard, it's that we hold very dear certain principles, political ideas, sociological ideas about people, how they interact, about what human life is about, and we cannot accept what the church teaches. and Christ himself is the obstacle. The gospel itself is the obstacle. And the only thing that can overcome this obstacle is humility. We have to be humble enough to recognize that it doesn't mean we have to swallow and not use our brains, but we have to be humble enough to recognize that there might be something in the church that we need to learn from, and to be formed more by the truth of the gospel than by the falsehood of the world. This is a tough one, but the key here is these friends of this paralytic man invite him, bring him into the presence of Jesus, and they overcome the obstacles that are in front of them. During Great Lent, it's our opportunity to overcome the obstacles that are in front of us in a variety of ways, whether we put them there or whether they're placed in front of us. And that's really all I want to say about the gospel passage. I'd like to turn now to the letter to the Hebrews. And the passage begins, "In the beginning thou, Lord, didst found the earth in the beginning, and the heavens are the work of thy hands. They will perish, but thou remainest. They will all grow old like a garment. Like a mantle thou wilt roll them up, and they will be changed. But thou art the same, and thy years will never end. But to what angel has he ever said, Sit at my right hand till I make enemies a stool for thy feet? Are they not all ministering spirits sent forth to serve for the sake of those who are obtained salvation? Therefore we must pay closer attention to what we have heard, lest we drift away from it. For if the message declared by angels was valid, and every transgression or disobedience received a just retribution, how shall we escape if we neglect such a great salvation? It was declared at first by the Lord, and it was attested to us by those who heard him." All except for one of the Sunday epistle readings during Lent are from Hebrews. And they're all like this. They seem inscrutable. And they're inscrutable for two reasons. One, they're never given to us in the full argument. We always get something grabbed out of the middle of an argument of Hebrews, and then we read it, and we're not sure why we're saying these things. We're not sure why we're concerned about these things, and it's hard to kind of contextualize them. Second, in order to understand anything in Hebrews, we have to understand its basic thrust. And it's one of the most beautiful letters in the New Testament, but it has a certain logic to it, and it's hard to understand it if we don't have that logic. First, the interesting thing is we call it the Epistle to the Hebrews, but unlike all of other Paul's letters, which open with a sender and a greeting, he'll say, Paul the Apostle to the church in Thessalonica, greetings. Paul, Silvanus, and Timothy to the church of the Thessalonians, greetings. Paul and Sosthenes to the church in Corinth, greetings, right? He says who it is, and then he identifies his recipient. Hebrews just begins. It doesn't tell that it's by Paul. It says, long ago, God spoke to our ancestors in many and various ways by the prophets, etc. It just dives right in. And some have argued that Hebrews isn't a letter and never was a letter. It calls itself a logos parakleseos, a word of exhortation, And in Acts 13, when St. Paul is visiting a synagogue, he is asked, do you have a word of exhortation for us? A logos parakleseos. And so some people think that Hebrews might be an example of a sermon, a word of exhortation. And it certainly does seem to have that quality. It is highly rhetorical. It is highly, highly rhetorical. The letter to the Hebrews plays with language and is careful about its argumentation more than any other document in the New Testament. We see, and I'll just give you a quick review of these things before we get to the point and the argument of Hebrews that will help us understand today's passage. There's a lot of alliteration. Alliteration is when opening letters are repeated in words simultaneously, like Mad Max means madness, right? I just grabbed a few words. There's also assonance, where there's a repetition of vowels and consonants within a word. And here, this is the first line of Hebrews in Greek, written in English, in English transliteration. And you can see, look at all the P's, the L's, the M's, the R's. Polymeros ke polytropos paleotheos lalisas tis patrasin en tis prophetes. There's a lot of P's and L's and R's and S's. And that's not by accident, that's by design. Hebrews also relies on a device called anaphora. And this was something from the passage last week, where we talked about the great cloud of witnesses, where each sentence begins with a word that's repeated over and over again, right? Faith is the assurance of things hoped for. By faith, our ancestors. By faith, we understand. By faith, Abel. By faith, Enoch. Without faith, it is impossible. By faith, Noah. By faith. And it's like a hammer blow making the point, right? Hebrews also operates according to a series of antitheses between flesh and spirit, between earth and heaven, the one and the many, the old and the new, the external and the internal. It's a very rich rhetorical piece. But the key that unlocks every passage, the key that unlocks everything, is set in the first two lines right here. All right? It starts with in many and various ways. And the word there, the first word is polymeros ke polytropos. Polytropos. This word polytropos it's interesting because it's the third word in Hebrews. And to begin a text and refer to polytropos is interesting because the Odyssey begins by referring to Odysseus as polytropon, right? Andra mienepe musa polytropon. So to start a work by I'm not saying that the letter to the Hebrews has an Odyssey theology or anything ridiculous like that, but there's a nod toward being learned here. There's a nod toward literary sophistication here. But all of these rhetorical devices are not just empty playing with words. They all have a very specific and a very profound purpose. And that purpose is clear when we look at Hebrews 1:1-2. In the first two lines, we read, long ago, God spoke to our ancestors by the prophets, but in these last days, he has spoken to us by a son. And notice how when you stack them on top of each other, you see that they mirror one another, but they mirror one another in a way that has an accent at the end. And what do I mean by that? So the first line starts with a time statement, long ago. And that's contrasted to in these last days. And then long ago, God spoke, and in these last days, he has spoken. But to whom did he speak? In the Old Testament, long ago, he spoke to our fathers. He spoke to our ancestors. Now he has spoken to us. And then this is where the big contrast comes in. Long ago, he spoke by the prophets. And the prophets are good. The prophets are important. Everyone respects the prophets. But now he has spoken to us by a son. Right? Everything in Hebrews sets up this contrast of it's called many different things. It's like a comparison that accentuates that what happens in Jesus is greater than what happened in the past. But that doesn't mean what happened in the past is worthless, because the prophets are incredibly important. But what happened in the past, if that was important, then how much more is what happens in Jesus important? And it's a minore ad maios in Latin, from the lesser to the greater, the light and the heavy in Hebrew, kal vachomer. In Greek, it's just called comparison. But everything in Hebrews operates this way. And so in the other passages that we'll read during Lent, they'll talk about the priesthood. And they'll say, well, the priesthood of the temple had many sacrifices, but Jesus makes only one sacrifice. And in the temple sacrifice, there was this quality, but in the sacrifice of Jesus, there's an even greater quality. It's not a way of saying that the temple sacrifice is worthless. That was very important. But if that was important, this is even greater, which means it's more important. Everything in Hebrews operates on this principle. Jesus will say, the letter will say, that Moses was a servant in God's house in chapter 3. And in the passage from Numbers, where Moses was a servant in God's house, Moses is praised because he was a faithful servant, but he was only a servant. Jesus was a son, right? So what happened in Moses was very important, and something greater has happened now. How does this apply to our passage today, right? How does it apply to our passage today? Well, the first part of Hebrews is a comparison of the ministry of what is said about the Son in Old Testament passages and what is said about the angels. And I'm just going to pause the recording very quickly, and I'm going to stop sharing for just. So here is the passage from Hebrews 1. Again, it starts with, in many and various ways, God spoke of old to our fathers by the prophets, but in these last days, he has spoken to us by a son. We just read that earlier. And then it goes on, and as it continues, at the end, it compares Jesus to the angels. Having become as much superior to angels as the name he has obtained is more excellent than theirs. And then we get a series of Old Testament passages where where Hebrews compares Jesus to the angels. He says, "For to what angel did he ever say, 'You are my son, today I have begotten you'? Or again, 'I will be to him a father, and he shall be to me a son'?" Right? And again, not only that, he never said those great things to angels. What he said to angels was, "Let all God's angels worship him." In other words, they're supposed to worship the Son, right? And then he says, of the angels, he says, they are winds and servants, flames of fire. They are just servants. But of the Son, your throne, O God, is forever and ever. The angels are servants. The Son rules. And so we get in these opening lines of Hebrews a comparison of the angels and Jesus. And our passage picks up right about here. It says, in the beginning, and thou did found the earth in the beginning, and the heavens are the work of thy hands, right? But to what angel has he ever said, sit at my right hand till I make thy enemies a stool for your feet? Right? And we'll go back to our handout now, because that's roughly where our passage picks up. Right? But thou art the same, and thy years on it. But to what angel has he ever said, sit at my right hand till I make your enemies a stool for your feet? Right? And then it goes on to say, therefore we must pay closer to attention to what we have heard, lest we drift away from it. For if the message declared by angels was valid, and every transgression or disobedience received a just retribution, how shall we escape if we neglect such a great salvation? So, let's just follow this sort of systematically. Jesus is compared to the angels, and he is superior because he is the Lord and they are servants. But all of this seems to find its purpose here in the line. If the message declared by angels was valid and received a just retribution if you broke it, how shall we escape if we neglect such a great salvation? So the distinction between Jesus and the angels is really a distinction between the message of Jesus and the message of the angels. But what's the message of the angels? The message of the angels is the law of Moses. In Second Temple Judaism, the Judaism in the time of Jesus, it was believed that Moses did not directly receive the law from God on Mount Sinai. It says it was delivered to him through an intermediary, through angels. Galatians 3, why then the law? It was added because of transgressions until the offspring should come to when the promise had been made, and it was put in place through angels by an intermediary. Acts 7 also says, you have received the law that was given through angels, but have not obeyed it. In the book of Jubilees, which is a Second Temple text, which basically retells the first several books of the Old Testament, we have an angel speaking to Moses, and an angel right? The angel saying, I have written in the book of the first law, in which I have written for you that you should celebrate in its season one day. In other words, explaining the law. So the angel declares the law to Moses. So the argument that Jesus is superior to the angels has as its purpose the argument that the message of Jesus is superior to the message of the angels. And the reason to say that is to encourage people to take seriously their faith in Jesus Christ. Because if, as everyone knows, the law had requirements, and if you broke those requirements, you had to face retribution or punishment, how much more must we, who have this greater message than the law, try to live up to it and adhere to it totally and completely? Because the message of Jesus, as we see in the Sermon on the Mount, is an intensification of the law. We might imagine sometimes that we don't have to do all those details of the law anymore, and that our life is easier and it's more relaxed than a Jewish life. That's not the case, because the law only cared about your behavior. The gospel cares about your inner disposition. Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount, you've heard that it was said to men of old, do not commit murder. I tell you, don't get angry, don't hate. The law said, do not commit adultery. I tell you, do not fall into lust, right? The battleground is no longer the more simple battleground of our behavior. It's the battleground of our minds and our hearts. And the letter to the Hebrews is telling us that if it mattered that we broke the law of the Old Testament, which was concerned with our behavior, how much more does it matter that we take seriously the gospel, which governs our hearts? And this is something to consider during the period of Great Lent, because this is a time when we try to more intensely follow the gospel. And Hebrews, as a word of exhortation, urges us to do that, urges us to take ever more seriously our life in Christ. And all of these comparisons between Jesus and the angels, between Jesus and Moses, between Jesus and the high priesthood, have as their goal to show us that the gospel is the most important thing in the world, and it should be the most important thing in our own lives. So the thing that holds together the epistle passage from Hebrews and the gospel passage from Mark is that Mark shows us that there will be obstacles to our faith, and there will be things that we have to overcome both in ourselves and in the world around us. But we do that because in the same way that we would overcome obstacles to anything in life that we thought was important, so how much more must we overcome them to encounter that thing which is the most important thing in the world and is a matter of life and death, the gospel of Jesus Christ. And so this is what holds together the gospel reading, which is about overcoming obstacles to our faith, and the word of exhortation contained in the letter to the Hebrews, which is a reminder of just how important the gospel is to our lives and how important we must take it, that we have to live it. Christe